The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden planks of Dry Creek's main street. But inside the Bennett house, Clara felt as though she were drowning in darkness. She sat before her vanity mirror, watching her mother's trembling hands adjust the delicate lace veil that had been worn by Bennett women for 3 generations. The reflection staring back at her seemed like a stranger, pale, resigned, beautiful in the way a porcelain doll is beautiful, and just as lifeless. "You look radiant, my dear," her mother whispered, though Martha Bennett's voice carried the weight of someone trying to convince herself as much as her daughter. "Charles is a good man, a prosperous man. You'll want for nothing." Clara's fingers traced the intricate beadwork on her ivory silk gown, each tiny pearl sewn by the finest seamstresses her father's money could buy. The dress was beautiful, she had to admit, with its high neckline, fitted bodice, and sweeping train that would trail behind her down the aisle of Dry Creek's small wooden church. But wearing it felt like donning a burial shroud. "Nothing except happiness," Clara murmured, so quietly her mother pretended not to hear. Through the lace curtains of her bedroom window, Clara could see the townspeople gathering outside the church across the dusty street, women in their Sunday best, men in dark suits that looked uncomfortable in the rising heat, children chasing each other between the horses and carriages. All of Dry Creek had turned out for the wedding of the banker's daughter to the cattle baron. It was the social event of the year, perhaps the decade, in their small frontier town. Clara's father, Edmund Bennett, appeared in the doorway, his substantial frame filling the entrance. His silver mustache was perfectly waxed, his black suit immaculate, and his gold pocket watch chain glinted in the morning light. He was the picture of prosperity and respectability, the most powerful man in 3 counties. His bank held the mortgages on half the ranches in the territory, and his word could make or break a man's future. "Time to go, Clara," he said, his voice carrying the same authority he used when foreclosing on a failing ranch. "Charles is waiting." Clara rose from her chair, the weight of the dress and veil making her movements slow and deliberate. She thought of Charles Morgan, waiting for her at the altar, a man 20 years her senior, with kind enough eyes but hands that felt cold even on the warmest days. He owned the largest cattle operation in the territory, with thousands of head and more land than some entire states back east. On paper, he was everything a woman should want in a husband. In her heart, he felt like a prison cell with golden bars. As they walked toward the church, Clara's mind wandered to the hills beyond the town, where she used to ride her horse before her father decided such activities were unbecoming for a young lady of her station. She remembered the freedom of those rides, the wind in her hair, the vast open sky above her. She had been 16 then, still believing the world held endless possibilities. Now, at 22, she felt ancient. The church bells rang out across the valley, their bronze voices calling the faithful to witness her surrender. Clara took her father's arm, feeling the rough wool of his sleeve against her gloved hand. His grip was firm, possessive, as if he feared she might bolt like a spooked colt. "You're doing the right thing," he said, though whether he was reassuring her or himself remained unclear. "This marriage will secure our family's position for generations. Charles's land, combined with our banking interests, will make us the most powerful family in the territory." Clara nodded, because nodding was easier than speaking. She understood the politics of frontier life, the way marriages were business arrangements disguised as romance. Love was a luxury few could afford in a land where survival depended on practical alliances. But understanding and accepting were 2 different things entirely. Inside the church, the wooden pews creaked under the weight of Dry Creek's entire population. The air was thick with the scent of wildflowers, lupines and Indian paintbrush that the local women had gathered from the meadows, and the nervous perspiration of too many people crowded into too small a space. Clara's heels echoed on the pine floorboards as she walked down the aisle, her father's steady presence beside her the only thing keeping her feet moving forward. Charles stood at the altar in his finest black suit, his silver hair slicked back with pomade, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. He was a handsome man, in the way that prosperity and confidence could make any man handsome. But his smile felt rehearsed, as if he too understood this was more performance than passion. The preacher, Reverend Hayes, opened his worn Bible and began the familiar words that would bind her to a life she had never chosen. Clara's mind drifted again, this time to conversations overheard between her parents when they thought she wasn't listening. Talk of debts, of changing times, of the need for security in an uncertain world. Her marriage wasn't just about her future. It was about saving the family from some unspoken financial difficulty her father had never fully explained. As the ceremony progressed, Clara found herself studying the faces in the congregation. Neighbors who had watched her grow up, ranch wives who knew the harsh realities of frontier life, young women her own age who looked at her with a mixture of envy and sympathy. Did they see her good fortune? Or did they recognize the cage being built around her with words and witnesses? The preacher's voice droned on about duty and obedience, about the sacred bonds of matrimony. Clara felt as though she were underwater, hearing everything through a thick, distorting medium. When prompted, she spoke her responses in a voice that sounded nothing like her own. Charles's answers were confident, certain, the words of a man who had never doubted his right to claim what he wanted. As the ceremony neared its conclusion, Clara caught sight of herself in the small mirror that hung beside the church's front window. The reflection showed a beautiful bride, everything a woman should be on her wedding day. But the eyes looking back at her were those of a stranger, someone who had learned to wear compliance like a mask. She thought of the girl she had been just a few years ago, wild and free as the mustangs that roamed the high country. That girl seemed as distant now as the mountains on the horizon, visible but forever out of reach. In a few moments, she would be Mrs. Charles Morgan, respectable wife of a respected man, and that wild girl would be buried forever beneath layers of propriety and expectation. The preacher raised his hand for the final blessing, and Clara felt the weight of her future settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. This was her life now, mapped out in careful, practical lines. Safe, secure, and utterly without the one thing she had always secretly hoped for, a love that would set her soul on fire rather than slowly extinguish its flame. The night before her wedding, Clara lay awake in her childhood bed, staring at the patterns moonlight made through her lace curtains. Sleep eluded her as memories she had tried to bury came flooding back like water through a broken dam. In the quiet hours before dawn, her mind wandered to a time when her world had been larger than the confines of proper society, to a summer 5 years ago when everything had seemed possible. She had been 17 then, still allowed the freedom of riding her mare, Rosie, through the rolling hills that surrounded Dry Creek. Her father had not yet decided that such activities were beneath a young lady of her station, and her mother still believed that fresh air and exercise were beneficial for a growing girl. Those had been golden days, filled with the kind of liberty she now realized she would never know again. It was during one of those rides that she had first encountered Luke Carter. She remembered the day with startling clarity, the way the summer heat had shimmered off the grassland, the scent of sage and wildflowers carried on the warm breeze, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. She had been following a deer trail up into the foothills when she heard the sharp crack of breaking wood. followed by a string of colorful language that would have made her mother faint. Curious despite her upbringing, Clara had guided Rosie toward the sound and found a young man struggling with a fallen fence post. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and hair the color of winter wheat. His clothes were practical, worn denim, a faded cotton shirt, scuffed leather boots, the uniform of a working cowhand. But there was something about the way he carried himself, a quiet dignity that spoke of inner strength rather than inherited privilege. When he looked up and saw her watching, he had immediately straightened and removed his hat, revealing eyes the color of a mountain lake, deep blue-green with flecks of gold. "Begging your pardon, miss," he had said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that suggested he hailed from somewhere farther south. "Didn't know there was a lady present." Most men in Dry Creek either treated her with the nervous deference due to the banker's daughter or the calculating attention of those who saw her as a means to advancement. But this stranger looked at her simply as a person, with genuine warmth and something that might have been amusement dancing in his remarkable eyes. "I'm Clara Bennett," she had said, unconsciously straightening in her saddle. "This is my father's land." "Luke Carter," he had replied, settling his hat back on his head. "Working for Tom Morrison this summer, helping to move his herd up to the high pasture. That fence post decided to give up the ghost at the worst possible moment." They had talked for nearly an hour that first day about horses and weather, about the beauty of the country and the challenges of ranch life. Luke spoke with an easy intelligence that surprised her, discussing everything from the best grasses for cattle to the migration patterns of the elk that moved through the high country each fall. He had a way of listening that made her feel as though her thoughts and opinions actually mattered, something she had rarely experienced in her carefully controlled social circle. As the weeks passed, Clara found herself riding toward Morrison's land more and more often, always with some excuse. Checking on the boundary markers, looking for stray cattle, gathering wildflowers for her mother's table. Luke was usually somewhere on the range, and their paths seemed to cross with remarkable frequency. Their conversations grew longer and more intimate. Luke told her about his childhood in Texas, about losing his parents to fever when he was barely 15, about making his way north in search of better opportunities. He spoke of his dreams, modest dreams perhaps, but heartfelt ones. He wanted land of his own someday, a small spread where he could raise cattle and horses, maybe start a family. Nothing grand or ambitious, just an honest living earned through hard work and determination. Clara found herself sharing things she had never told anyone. Her frustration with the restrictions placed on her because of her gender and social position, her longing for adventure and purpose beyond the narrow confines of what was considered appropriate for a lady. Luke listened without judgment, occasionally offering insights that showed he understood her struggles in ways that surprised her. "Seems to me," he had said one afternoon as they sat beside Morrison's Creek, watching the water flow over smooth stones, "that being born with advantages shouldn't mean giving up your spirit. Money and position are fine things, but they're not worth much if they cost you your soul." Those words had haunted Clara long after Luke disappeared from her life. His departure had been as sudden as a summer storm. One day he was there, fixing fences and moving cattle with his quiet competence, and the next, he was gone. Tom Morrison's wife, Ellen, had mentioned something about trouble in town, about accusations and misunderstandings, but the details were vague and contradictory. Clara had learned the fuller story only gradually, piecing together fragments from overheard conversations and carefully worded gossip. Apparently, there had been some disagreement with one of the town's more prominent citizens, something about a card game, money that went missing, and accusations that were never quite proven but never quite dispelled either. Luke had chosen to leave rather than fight charges that might have been difficult to defend against, especially for a drifter with no family name or influential friends to vouch for his character. The injustice of it had burned in Clara's chest like a physical pain. She had known Luke well enough to be certain he was incapable of the petty theft he had been accused of. But her certainty meant nothing in a world where perception often mattered more than truth. For months after his departure, she had ridden the hills looking for some sign of him, some indication that he might return. She had questioned Tom Morrison and the other ranchers, but Luke Carter had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Eventually, her father had curtailed her riding privileges, claiming that a young woman of 18 had more important things to concern herself with than wandering the countryside like a wild creature. Now, lying in her bed on the eve of her wedding to Charles Morgan, Clara wondered what had become of Luke Carter. Was he still somewhere in the territory, working other ranches under other names? Had he found the land he dreamed of, built the life he wanted? Did he ever think of those summer afternoons by Morrison's Creek, when two young people had shared dreams and hopes under the endless western sky? She closed her eyes and tried to recall every detail of his face. The strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the careful gentleness of his hands when he helped her down from her horse. She had been young and naive then, barely understanding the feelings he stirred in her heart. Now, with the wisdom that came from years of disappointment and compromise, she recognized what she had lost. A sound from outside drew her attention, the distant thunder of hoofbeats on the hard-packed road that led into town. Clara rose from her bed and moved to the window, pressing her face against the cool glass. A lone rider was passing through the moonlit street, his form indistinct in the shadows. Something about the way he sat his horse, the set of his shoulders, sent a jolt of recognition through her chest. But that was impossible. Luke Carter was long gone, probably 1,000 miles away by now. The rider disappeared into the darkness beyond the church, and Clara told herself she was seeing phantoms born of her own desperate hopes. Still, as she returned to her bed and tried once more to find sleep, she could not shake the feeling that something was about to change. The very air seemed charged with possibility, as if the universe itself were holding its breath in anticipation. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Charles Morgan, dutiful wife and respectable member of society. But tonight, for just a few more hours, she could still dream of summer afternoons and blue-green eyes, of a man who had seen her soul and found it worth treasuring. Reverend Hayes cleared his throat and opened his worn Bible to the final passage, the one that would seal Clara's fate with words as binding as iron shackles. The congregation held its collective breath, sensing the solemnity of the moment when Clara Bennett would become Mrs. Charles Morgan. The morning sun streamed through the church's simple windows, casting rectangles of golden light across the wooden floor where Clara stood in her ivory silk gown. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony and tradition. "We are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. If any person has just cause why these two should not be wed, let him speak now or forever hold his peace." It was a formality, nothing more. In all his years of performing marriage ceremonies in Dry Creek, Reverend Hayes had never once been interrupted during this portion of the service. The words were spoken out of tradition, not expectation. The congregation settled deeper into their pews, preparing for the final vows that would unite two of the territory's most prominent families. But today would be different. The thunder of hoofbeats rose from the dusty street outside, growing louder with each passing second. At first, the assembled guests assumed it was simply a late arrival. perhaps someone riding hard to catch the end of the ceremony. But the sound didn't diminish or stop at the church's hitching post. Instead, it grew more insistent, more urgent, accompanied now by the sharp sound of a horse being reined in hard. Clara felt her heart begin to race, though she couldn't say why. Something in the rhythm of those hoofbeats seemed familiar, as if her body recognized what her mind dared not hope for. Charles, standing beside her at the altar, frowned slightly and glanced toward the church doors, his weathered face showing mild irritation at the disturbance. Edmund Bennett's jaw tightened as he sat in the front pew. As the most powerful man in 3 counties, he was unaccustomed to having his important occasions disrupted, and his displeasure was evident in the rigid set of his shoulders. The hoofbeats stopped abruptly, followed by the creak of leather and the jingle of spurs. Heavy bootfalls echoed on the wooden steps outside the church, each footstep deliberate and determined. The congregation began to murmur, turning in their seats to face the doors that led to the street. Reverend Hayes paused in his reading, uncertain how to proceed. In his 40 years of ministry, he had never encountered such a dramatic interruption. He looked questioningly at Edmund Bennett, seeking guidance from the man who effectively controlled the town's spiritual as well as financial affairs. The church doors burst open with a bang that echoed through the small building like a gunshot. Dust swirled in the sudden flood of sunlight, and through that golden haze stepped a figure that made Clara's knees go weak with recognition and disbelief. Luke Carter stood silhouetted in the doorway, his tall frame backlit by the morning sun. He wore dark trousers and a white shirt open at the collar, his weathered leather vest bearing the dust of hard travel. His boots were scuffed, his hair windblown, and there was something wild and desperate in his bearing that spoke of a man who had ridden through the night to reach this place at this moment. But it was his eyes that captured Clara's attention. Those same blue-green eyes that had haunted her dreams for 5 years. Now blazing with an intensity that seemed to burn away everything else in the room. He looked older, harder perhaps, shaped by whatever trials and tribulations had filled the years since his departure from Dry Creek. But beneath the changes wrought by time and experience, he was unmistakably the man who had listened to her dreams beside Morrison's Creek. The congregation erupted in shocked whispers and gasps. Some of the older residents recognized him, despite the years that had passed. Others simply stared in amazement at the audacity of someone interrupting the most important social event in the town's recent memory. "What is the meaning of this?" Charles demanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "This is a private ceremony. You have no business here." Luke ignored him completely. His gaze was fixed solely on Clara, as if the two of them were alone in the church despite the dozens of witnesses surrounding them. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried clearly through the suddenly silent building. "Clara." Her name on his lips was like a key turning in a long-locked door. All the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart in the past 5 years began to crumble. She stared at him, drinking in every detail of his face, hardly daring to believe he was real and not some desperate hallucination born of her wedding day fears. Edmund Bennett rose from his seat, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "How dare you interrupt my daughter's wedding?" he thundered. "Sheriff Morrison, arrest this man for disturbing the peace." But Sheriff Tom Morrison, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the church, made no move to intervene. He remembered Luke Carter as an honest, hard-working man who had been driven from town by whispered accusations that were never proven. He also knew something about the political machinery that could destroy a man's reputation when it suited certain powerful interests. Luke took a step further into the church, his spurs ringing against the wooden floor. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He raised his hand, not in greeting but in a gesture that commanded attention. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute conviction. "I'm here because I heard that Clara Bennett was marrying a man she doesn't love, and I couldn't let that happen without giving her a choice." "She's made her choice," Charles snapped, moving protectively closer to Clara. "She's chosen to honor her family and marry a man who can provide for her properly." Luke's gaze never wavered from Clara's face. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice gentle despite the tension crackling through the air. "Is this what you really want, Clara? Is this the life you dreamed of when we used to talk about the future?" Clara felt as though she were drowning and gasping for air at the same time. Every eye in the church was upon her, waiting for her response. Her father's face was purple with rage. Her mother looked ready to faint, and Charles stood beside her like a man whose property was being challenged by a trespasser. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the man standing in the doorway, offering her something she had thought lost forever, a choice. Luke extended his hand toward her, a gesture both simple and profound. "Come with me," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos of shocked voices and angry demands. "Or stay and spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been. But decide now, Clara, because this is the only chance either of us will ever have." The church fell silent again, as if the entire congregation were holding their breath. Clara looked at the hand extended toward her, then at Charles's face. Kind enough, but cold with the calculation of a business transaction. She thought of the years stretching ahead of her, years of propriety and respectability and slow suffocation of her spirit. Then she looked at Luke's eyes and saw reflected there the girl she used to be, wild and free and full of dreams. She saw summer afternoons and endless possibilities. Love that would demand everything from her but give back even more. Her hands moved to her veil, trembling fingers working at the delicate pins that held it in place. The lace fell away from her face like chains being broken, pooling at her feet in a whisper of silk and dreams deferred. "Clara, no!" her father shouted, lunging forward to stop her. But Clara was already moving, her ivory skirts rustling as she stepped away from the altar, away from Charles' outstretched hand, away from the life that had been planned for her without her consent. Each step toward Luke felt like a small rebellion, a reclaiming of the person she had buried beneath years of duty and expectation. She placed her hand in his, feeling the calloused strength of his fingers closing around hers. The touch was electric, sending warmth racing up her arm and straight to her heart. "I choose you," she whispered, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute truth. Luke's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Without another word, he turned toward the door, Clara's hand clasped firmly in his. Together, they walked through the congregation that parted before them like water, past the shocked faces and scandalized whispers, toward the rectangle of sunlight that promised freedom. Behind them, the church erupted in chaos, her father's furious shouts, her mother's wails, Charles's demands for justice. But Clara heard none of it. All she could hear was the sound of her own heart beating in time with Luke's footsteps as they crossed the threshold and stepped into their uncertain but chosen future. The moment Clara's feet touched the dusty ground outside the church, Luke swept her up onto his horse, a magnificent black stallion that danced with barely contained energy. The animal seemed to sense the urgency of their situation, its dark eyes rolling white at the edges as the sounds of chaos erupted from the building behind them. Clara's wedding dress, with its layers of silk and petticoats, proved challenging to manage on horseback. The fabric billowed around them like a white cloud as Luke settled her sideways across his lap, one strong arm encircling her waist to keep her secure. She could feel the warmth of his body through the thin cotton of his shirt, solid and reassuring against the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. "Hold on tight," he murmured against her ear, his breath warm on her neck. "We need to put some distance between us and your father's anger before he organizes a proper pursuit." Behind them, the church doors flew open again as Edmund Bennett stormed out, his face contorted with rage. "Stop them," he bellowed to anyone within earshot. "That man is kidnapping my daughter." But Clara turned in Luke's arms and called back clearly, her voice carrying across the dusty street. "I'm going willingly, Papa. This is my choice." Luke spurred his horse forward, and they thundered down Dry Creek's main street in a cloud of dust. Clara's veil, forgotten in their haste, caught in the morning breeze and fluttered behind them like a white flag of surrender, or perhaps of victory. The ivory silk of her dress was already collecting dust from the road, the pristine gown that had cost her father a small fortune beginning its transformation from wedding finery to travel wear. As they raced past the general store, the blacksmith shop, and the small houses that lined the town's single street, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years, pure, exhilarating freedom. The wind whipped her carefully arranged hair loose from its pins, sending dark strands streaming behind her. Her heart pounded not with fear but with excitement, as if she were finally waking up from a long, suffocating dream. "Where are we going?" she called over the thunder of hoofbeats and the rushing wind. "Somewhere safe," Luke replied, his voice steady despite their desperate flight. "Somewhere your father's influence can't reach us, at least not immediately." They rode hard for nearly an hour, following deer trails and cattle paths that led away from the main roads. Luke seemed to know the country intimately, guiding his horse through terrain that would have challenged even an experienced rider. They crossed streams where the stallion's hooves sent up sprays of crystal water, climbed rocky slopes where every step had to be carefully chosen, and descended into hidden valleys where the only sounds were birdsong and the whisper of wind through tall grass. As they put distance between themselves and Dry Creek, Clara began to laugh, a sound that started as nervous relief but grew into something deeper and more joyous. The absurdity of her situation struck her fully. Here she was, racing across the wilderness in a wedding dress, clinging to a man she hadn't seen in 5 years, having just abandoned the most important social event of her life. "You're laughing," Luke observed, a note of wonder in his voice as he slowed the horse to a more sustainable pace. "I can't help it," Clara gasped, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes. "Look at me. I look like some mad woman who escaped from an asylum. My dress is ruined. My hair is a disaster. And I've probably just created the biggest scandal in the territory's history." "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. And she heard the vulnerability beneath the question. Clara turned to study his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the concentration in his eyes as he navigated the rough terrain, the way his hair curled slightly at his collar. 5 years had changed him, adding lines around his eyes and a certain hardness to his features that spoke of difficult experiences. But the essential Luke, the man who had listened to her dreams and made her feel truly seen, was still there. "No," she said firmly. "I don't regret it. For the first time in years, I feel like myself again." They paused at a stream to rest the horse and allow Clara to attempt some repairs to her appearance. The wedding dress, magnificent as it was, had not been designed for horseback riding. The hem was torn and muddy, the bodice wrinkled from being pressed against Luke's chest, and the delicate beadwork had snagged on his vest buttons. As Clara knelt beside the stream to splash cool water on her face, Luke told her about the years since he'd left Dry Creek. He'd worked ranches from Texas to Montana, always moving. never staying long enough to put down roots. He'd saved every penny he could, learning all he could about cattle and horses, building a reputation as a reliable hand despite the cloud that had followed him from their hometown. "I heard about your engagement 3 weeks ago," he said, his hands busy adjusting the stallion's tack. "A traveling merchant mentioned it in passing, said the banker's daughter was marrying the biggest cattle baron in the territory. I knew it had to be you." "And you came back," Clara said, still hardly believing it. "I had to." His eyes met hers across the narrow stream. "I couldn't live with myself knowing you were marrying someone else without at least giving you the choice to come with me. Maybe I had no right. Maybe I was being selfish, but—" "You had every right," Clara interrupted. "You were the only one who asked me what I wanted instead of telling me what I should want." They remounted and continued their journey, following a winding path that led higher into the foothills. The landscape around them grew wilder and more beautiful with each mile, rolling meadows dotted with wildflowers, stands of aspen that whispered secrets in the breeze, and always the mountains rising ahead of them like purple sentinels against the sky. As the afternoon wore on, Clara became aware of the sound of pursuit. It was faint at first, a distant rumble that might have been thunder if not for the clear sky. But gradually it grew more distinct, resolving into the unmistakable rhythm of multiple horses moving fast. Luke heard it too. His jaw tightened, and he urged his stallion to greater speed despite the challenging terrain. "Your father works quickly," he said grimly. "That sounds like at least 6 riders, maybe more." The chase added a new urgency to their flight. Clara found herself clinging more tightly to Luke's waist as they navigated increasingly treacherous paths. Her wedding dress, already damaged, suffered further indignities as they pushed through thick brush and ducked under low-hanging branches. But she discovered that she didn't care about the dress anymore. It belonged to the woman she had been that morning. The dutiful daughter who had been prepared to sacrifice her happiness for family expectations. The woman she was becoming needed different clothes, different dreams, different possibilities. "There's a line shack about 2 miles ahead," Luke called over his shoulder. "We can rest there and decide what to do next." But even as he spoke, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Their pursuers were gaining ground, riding hard and apparently unconcerned about the risks of pushing their horses over such difficult terrain. Clara could only imagine her father's fury, the promises of reward he had probably made to ensure swift action. Edmund Bennett was not a man accustomed to having his will thwarted, and he would not accept his daughter's defection lightly. As they crested a ridge, Clara caught sight of their pursuers for the first time. A group of men strung out along the valley floor below them, their horses dark against the golden grass. Even at this distance, she could see that they were well mounted and determined, closing the gap with every passing minute. "Luke," she said, her voice tight with concern. "They're getting closer." He nodded grimly, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead for any advantage they might gain. "I know. But we're almost there. Once we reach the shack, we'll have options. We can stand and fight, or we can slip away on foot if necessary." The word fight sent a chill through Clara. She hadn't fully considered that their flight might end in violence, that men might be hurt or killed because of her decision to choose love over duty. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak, but even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, she felt Luke's arm tighten protectively around her waist, felt the steady beat of his heart against her back. Whatever came next, they would face it together. For the first time in 5 years, she was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of a man who had crossed mountains and years to give her back her freedom. The line shack appeared ahead of them, a small wooden structure perched on a shelf of rock overlooking a hidden valley. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a roof to keep out the worst of the weather. But it represented sanctuary, a place where they could make their stand or plan their next move. As Luke guided his horse toward the shelter, Clara looked back one last time at the riders following them. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the life she had left behind in Dry Creek. She was committed now, for better or worse, to this wild adventure and the man who had made it possible. The line shack had served its purpose as a temporary refuge, but as dawn broke over the mountains 3 days later, Luke led Clara deeper into the wilderness to a place he had been preparing for months, a hidden valley that he had claimed as his own through the ancient rite of occupation and improvement. The journey took them along paths that seemed to exist only in Luke's memory, through stands of pine and aspen that grew so thick they formed natural tunnels of green shadow. Clara's ruined wedding dress had been replaced with practical clothes borrowed from the line shack's emergency supplies, men's trousers that she had to roll up at the ankles, a cotton shirt that hung loose on her slender frame, and a leather vest that smelled of wood smoke and honest work. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thin and sweet, carrying the scent of pine resin and wild herbs. Eagles circled overhead, their cries echoing off the granite peaks that surrounded them. Clara had never been this far from civilization, and the vastness of the wilderness both thrilled and humbled her. "There," Luke said finally, pointing toward a gap between 2 towering ridges. Home. The valley that opened before them was like something from a dream. A crystal-clear stream meandered through its center, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. Meadows of tall grass rolled away from the water's edge, dotted with wildflowers in every color imaginable. Purple lupines, golden black-eyed Susans, red Indian paintbrush, and white columbines that nodded in the gentle breeze. But it was the house that took Clara's breath away. Nestled against the southern slope of the valley, where it would catch the morning sun and be sheltered from the worst winter winds, stood a log cabin that spoke of careful planning and patient craftsmanship. The logs were perfectly fitted, chinked with clay and moss to keep out drafts. A stone chimney rose from one end, already sending a thin wisp of smoke into the clear mountain air. A covered porch stretched across the front, supported by posts that Luke had carved from fallen trees. "You built this?" Clara whispered, awe evident in her voice. Luke dismounted and helped her down from the horse, his hands gentle on her waist. "Started it 2 years ago," he said, pride and nervousness warring in his voice. "Every time I had a break between jobs, I'd come up here and work on it. Added rooms as I could afford the materials, improved things bit by bit." They walked toward the cabin together, Clara's borrowed boots crunching on the gravel path that Luke had laid from the stream to the front door. The porch was furnished with 2 chairs that he had made himself from bent willow, positioned to catch the evening light and provide a view of the entire valley. "It's not much compared to your father's house," Luke said, suddenly uncertain. "No servants, no fancy furnishings, just—" "It's perfect," Clara interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. "It's the most beautiful home I've ever seen." And she meant it. The cabin radiated warmth and welcome in a way that her father's grand house never had. Every detail spoke of Luke's care and attention, the way he had positioned the windows to frame views of the mountains. The herb garden planted near the kitchen door, the small stable he had built for his horse with room for 2 more animals. Inside, the cabin was larger than it appeared from the outside. The main room served as both kitchen and parlor, with a stone fireplace that would provide heat for the entire structure. Luke had built most of the furniture himself, a sturdy table and chairs, shelves for books and supplies, even a rocking chair positioned near the fireplace where someone could sit and watch the flames dance on winter evenings. "There are 2 bedrooms," Luke said, his cheeks coloring slightly as he gestured toward the back of the cabin. "I want you to know I don't expect anything from you, Clara. You can have all the time you need to decide what you want, to be sure this is really the life you want." Clara turned to study his face, seeing the uncertainty there, the fear that she might regret her impulsive decision to flee with him. 5 years of separation had not diminished her feelings for this man, but she understood his caution. What they had done was scandalous by any measure, and the life he was offering her was as different from her privileged upbringing as night from day. "Show me everything," she said simply. Over the next few hours, Luke guided her through his small domain with the enthusiasm of a man sharing his most treasured possessions. He showed her the root cellar where he stored vegetables and preserved meat, the workshop where he repaired tack and tools, the corral where his horse grazed contentedly. Everything was well planned and carefully maintained, evidence of a man who understood the demands of frontier life and had prepared accordingly. But it was the garden that truly captured Clara's imagination. Luke had cleared and cultivated nearly an acre of the valley's best soil, planting vegetables and herbs that would sustain them through the long mountain winters. Rows of corn stood shoulder high, their silk beginning to turn brown. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, red and gold and purple varieties that Clara had never seen before. Beans climbed wooden trellises, their pods thick and promising. "I've been reading everything I can find about mountain farming," Luke explained as they walked between the rows. "Trial and error mostly, but I'm learning what grows well at this altitude. The growing season is short, but the soil is rich, and the water is pure." Clara knelt to examine a pumpkin vine that sprawled across several square yards, its enormous leaves hiding orange spheres that would be perfect for winter storage. She had never grown anything in her life. Her mother's garden was tended by hired help, but something about the neat rows and careful cultivation appealed to her on a level she hadn't expected. "Teach me," she said, looking up at Luke with sudden determination. "I want to learn how to do this, how to be useful here." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise. "I was hoping you'd say that." They spent the afternoon working side by side in the garden, Clara learning to identify weeds from vegetables, to test soil moisture with her fingers, to harvest beans and tomatoes at their peak ripeness. Her soft hands, accustomed only to needlework and piano playing, quickly blistered from the unfamiliar work. But she persevered with a determination that surprised them both. As evening approached, they prepared their first meal together in the cabin's kitchen. Luke proved to be a competent cook, having learned the necessity of self-sufficiency during his years of solitary living. He showed Clara how to work the wood-burning stove, how to judge the temperature by holding her hand over the coals, how to make biscuits from scratch using ingredients stored in tin containers that kept out mice and moisture. They ate by lamplight at the table Luke had built, the simple meal of venison, beans, and fresh bread tasting better to Clara than any elaborate dinner she had ever enjoyed at her father's table. Outside, the mountain night settled over their valley like a protective blanket, filled with the sounds of owls and night birds, the distant howl of a coyote, and the gentle murmur of the stream. "Are you sorry?" Luke asked as they cleared away the dishes. "About leaving your old life? I mean, the comfort, the security, the—" "No," Clara said firmly, setting down the plate she had been washing. "I'm not sorry. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I belong." She moved to the window that looked out over the valley, now silver in the moonlight. The silence here was different from the oppressive quiet of her father's house. It was peaceful rather than stifling. full of possibility rather than restriction. Luke came to stand beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "It won't be easy," he said quietly. "Winters here are hard, and we'll be isolated for months at a time. There's no doctor within 50 miles, no neighbors to call on if something goes wrong. It's a lonely life sometimes." Clara turned to face him, seeing the concern in his eyes, the way he was trying to be honest about the challenges ahead. It was so different from the way Charles had courted her, promising only ease and luxury, never mentioning the price she would pay in freedom and autonomy. "Lonely?" she repeated, reaching out to touch his face gently. "How could I be lonely with you?" Luke caught her hand in his, pressing it against his cheek. "Clara, I need you to understand I don't have much to offer you. No grand house, no servants, no social position, just hard work and simple pleasures. And a love that's deeper than these mountains. That's more than anyone has ever offered me," she whispered. "It's everything I never knew I wanted." They stood together in the lamplight, two people who had found each other against all odds. Surrounded by the home Luke had built with his own hands, and the hope that they could build a life together with the same patient care. Outside, the wilderness stretched away in all directions, vast and challenging and beautiful, much like the future that lay ahead of them. For the first time since she was 17 years old, Clara felt truly, completely happy. This was home, not the grand house in Dry Creek with its servants and social obligations, but this simple cabin where she could be herself, where her dreams mattered as much as anyone else's, where love was not a luxury but the foundation upon which everything else was built. 3 weeks of peaceful mountain life came to an abrupt end on a crisp September morning when Luke's horse began showing signs of unease. The black stallion, normally calm and steady, paced restlessly in the corral, his ears pricked forward and his nostrils flaring as he tested the wind. Clara had learned to read the animal's moods during their time together, and his behavior sent a chill of apprehension down her spine. "Someone's coming," Luke said grimly, emerging from the stable with his rifle in hand. His face had taken on the hard, watchful expression she had glimpsed only once before, on the day he had burst into the church to claim her. Clara set down the basket of tomatoes she had been gathering and moved to his side, her heart beginning to race. They had known this moment would come eventually. Her father was not a man to give up easily, and the isolation that had protected them could not last forever. "How many?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear gnawing at her stomach. Luke squinted toward the mouth of the valley, where a dust cloud was beginning to rise above the tree line. Hard to say from this distance, at least 4 riders, maybe more. They had discussed this possibility many times during their weeks together, planning what they would do if pursuit finally caught up with them. The cabin was defensible, positioned with good sight lines and only one practical approach, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. More troubling still was the question of who led the pursuit and what authority they claimed. "Could be your father's men," Luke continued, checking his rifle's action with practiced efficiency. "Or he might have convinced the territorial marshal that I kidnapped you against your will." The thought made Clara's blood run cold. If her father had managed to involve the law, their situation became infinitely more complicated. Luke was already under suspicion from his previous troubles in Dry Creek, and the story of a ranch hand stealing a banker's daughter from her own wedding would play poorly with any jury in the territory. "Whatever happens," Clara said, moving closer to him, "we face it together. I won't let them take me back to a life I never chose." Luke's eyes softened for a moment as he looked at her, taking in the changes 3 weeks of mountain life had wrought. The pale, delicate girl who had fled her wedding had been replaced by a woman with sun-bronzed skin and capable hands. Her dark hair, no longer confined by pins and propriety, hung in a simple braid down her back. She wore the practical clothes of a frontier woman: sturdy skirt, cotton blouse, leather boots that could handle any terrain, and carried herself with a confidence that had been missing in her pampered former life. "Clara," he began, but she cut him off with a shake of her head. "No. Whatever you're thinking about sacrificing yourself to protect me, forget it. We're in this together. Luke Carter, for better or worse." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied now by voices calling across the valley. Clara strained to make out the words, her heart sinking as she recognized her father's voice among them, loud and commanding as always. "Clara Bennett, come out and face what you've done." Luke muttered something under his breath that would have made her mother faint, then checked his rifle one more time. "Stay behind me," he ordered. "And if shooting starts, get inside the cabin and keep your head down." But as the riders crested the rise that led down into their hidden valley, it became clear that this was not the simple pursuit party they had expected. Edmund Bennett rode at the head of a group that included not only his hired men but also a figure that made Clara's stomach drop. A tall, lean man wearing a badge that glinted in the morning sun. Marshal James Crawford was known throughout the territory as an honest lawman, but he was also a practical man who understood the political realities of frontier justice. If Edmund Bennett had convinced him that a crime had been committed, Crawford would be duty-bound to investigate, regardless of his personal feelings about the situation. Beside the marshal rode another figure that surprised them both. Charles Morgan, Clara's jilted bridegroom, his face set in lines of grim determination. He had armed himself with a Winchester rifle and wore the expression of a man who had been personally wronged and intended to collect satisfaction. "Luke Carter," Marshal Crawford's voice carried clearly across the valley. "You're wanted for questioning in the matter of Clara Bennett's disappearance. Come out peaceful, and we'll settle this according to law." Luke and Clara exchanged glances. They both knew that questioning could easily become something more permanent if the right pressure was applied to the right people. Still, Luke had always been a man who faced his troubles head-on rather than running from them. "What do you want to do?" Clara whispered. Luke was quiet for a long moment, his eyes calculating distances and possibilities. The riders had stopped about 100 yards from the cabin, close enough to talk but far enough away to avoid being easy targets if negotiations broke down. It was a professional positioning that spoke well of Marshal Crawford's experience, even if it complicated their own situation. "We talk," Luke decided, "but we do it on our terms." He stepped out onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. Clara at his side despite his earlier order to stay behind him. The morning sun was at their backs, putting their faces in shadow while illuminating the approaching riders clearly. "Marshal Crawford," Luke called out, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had nothing to hide. "You're welcome in my valley, but you'd better have good reason for bringing armed men to my home." "Your home?" Edmund Bennett's voice cracked like a whip across the distance between them. "This is public land, you thieving vagrant, and that's my daughter you've kidnapped." Clara stepped forward before Luke could respond, her voice ringing with conviction. "I am not kidnapped, Papa. I came here of my own free will, and I'm staying of my own free will." The words seemed to hit Edmund Bennett like physical blows. His face, already flushed from the hard ride, turned an alarming shade of purple. "You don't know what you're saying, girl. This man has obviously filled your head with lies and romantic nonsense. Come home now. and we'll say no more about this foolishness." "The only foolishness," Clara replied, her voice growing stronger with each word, "was nearly marrying a man I didn't love to satisfy your business arrangements. I'm a grown woman, Papa, not a piece of property to be traded for financial advantage." Charles Morgan spurred his horse forward a few steps, his hand tightening on his rifle. "Clara, you made a promise to me in front of God and the whole town. A decent woman honors her commitments." "A decent woman," Clara shot back, "chooses her own commitments instead of having them forced upon her." Marshal Crawford raised his hand for silence, his weathered face thoughtful as he studied the couple on the porch. He had known Luke Carter by reputation for years, had heard about his troubles in Dry Creek and the suspicious circumstances of his departure. But he had also heard other stories. Tales of Luke's honesty and reliability from ranchers who had employed him across the territory. "Miss Bennett," the marshal said carefully, "your father has filed a complaint alleging that Mr. Carter here took you from your wedding by force and against your will. That's a serious charge in this territory." "And a false one," Clara replied firmly. "Luke Carter asked me to choose Marshal Crawford. He didn't force me to do anything. The choice was mine, and I made it freely." "Under duress," Edmund Bennett exploded. She was confused, overwhelmed by the moment. She didn't understand what she was doing. "I understood perfectly," Clara said, her voice cutting through her father's protests like a blade. "I understood that I was about to spend the rest of my life as a possession rather than a person. I understood that my happiness meant nothing compared to your business interests. And I understood that Luke Carter was offering me the one thing no one else ever had: the freedom to choose my own life." The confrontation had reached a crucial moment, and everyone present seemed to sense it. The armed men shifted restlessly in their saddles, hands drifting toward weapons as tensions rose. Marshal Crawford's face remained impassive, but Clara could see him weighing her words, trying to determine the truth of a situation that was far more complex than a simple kidnapping. In the charged silence, a new voice spoke up. Tom Morrison, the rancher who had employed Luke years before and who had ridden with the Marshal's party as a local representative. His words would carry weight with Crawford, and everyone knew it. "Marshal," Morrison said slowly, "I've known both these young people for years. Luke Carter worked for me when he was barely more than a boy, and I never knew him to take anything that wasn't freely given. If Miss Bennett says she went willingly, I'm inclined to believe her." Edmund Bennett whirled on Morrison, his face twisted with fury. "You would say that? You've always resented my success. Morrison, this is just another way to strike at the Bennett family." But Morrison's calm words had shifted the dynamic of the confrontation. Other voices began to murmur agreement, men who had worked with Luke and found him honest. Ranchers who understood the difference between a man taking what he wanted and a woman choosing what she needed. The moment of decision had arrived, and Clara knew that what happened next would determine not just her future, but Luke's as well. The weight of choice, the same choice that had brought her to this valley, settled on her shoulders once again. The tension in the valley stretched taut as a bowstring as Marshal Crawford dismounted from his horse, his movements deliberate and careful. Clara could see him weighing every word that had been spoken, every gesture and expression, trying to parse truth from accusation in a situation that had no clear precedent in territorial law. "Mr. Carter," the marshal said, his voice carrying the authority of his office, "I'm going to need you to set that rifle down and step away from it. We're going to settle this matter with words, not weapons." Luke hesitated for a moment, his knuckles white where he gripped the Winchester. Clara could feel the tension radiating from him, the instinct to fight warring with his deeper nature. Finally, With deliberate care, he leaned the rifle against the porch railing and raised his hands slightly to show they were empty. "I'm not running, Marshal," Luke said quietly. "I've done nothing wrong, and I'm prepared to answer for my actions." "Luke, no," Clara began, but he silenced her with a gentle touch on her arm. "It's time for the truth. Clara, all of it." Edmund Bennett had dismounted as well and was striding toward the porch, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. Charles Morgan followed close behind, his hand resting on the butt of his sidearm. The other men remained mounted but alert, ready to act if the situation deteriorated. "The truth," Edmund spat, "is that this vagrant seduced my daughter with pretty words and false promises. He's probably been planning this for months, waiting for his chance to get his hands on the Bennett fortune." Luke's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "The only fortune I ever wanted, Mr. Bennett, was your daughter's happiness. And that's something you never seemed interested in providing." "How dare you?" Charles interjected, his face flushing with anger. "Clara was perfectly happy before you filled her head with romantic nonsense. She had everything a woman could want: security, position, a husband who could provide for her properly." "Everything except love," Clara said firmly, stepping forward to stand beside Luke. "Everything except the right to choose her own life." Marshal Crawford held up his hand for silence, his weathered face thoughtful. "Miss Bennett, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them honestly. Your answers will determine whether charges are filed here today." Clara nodded, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. "Ask me anything, Marshal. Did Luke Carter force you to leave your wedding?" "No, sir. He offered me a choice, and I made it freely." "Did he threaten you or your family in any way?" "No, sir. He simply asked me if I wanted to come with him." "Have you been held against your will at any time since leaving Dry Creek?" "Absolutely not. I've been free to leave whenever I chose. I stayed because this is where I want to be." Edmund Bennett could contain himself no longer. "She doesn't know what she's saying. She's been living in sin with this man for weeks. Her reputation is ruined, her future destroyed. She needs to come home where she can be properly cared for." "My reputation," Clara said, her voice rising with indignation, "is my own concern, and I am being properly cared for by a man who sees me as a person, not a possession." Charles stepped forward, his face twisted with hurt and anger. "Clara, we had an understanding. You promised to marry me in front of the whole town. A decent woman honors her commitments." Clara turned to face him fully, and for the first time since the confrontation began, her expression softened slightly. "Hey, Charles, I'm sorry for the public embarrassment. That was never my intention. But I cannot apologize for choosing honesty over obligation. You deserve a wife who loves you, not one who marries you out of duty." "Love!" Edmund Bennett exploded. "Love is a luxury for people who don't have to worry about practical matters. This man has nothing to offer you, Clara. No money, no position, no future. What happens when winter comes and you're trapped in this wilderness with no doctor, no neighbors, no help of any kind?" Luke had been silent during this exchange, but now he stepped forward, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the valley. "Mr. Bennett, you're right that I don't have much to offer your daughter in terms of material wealth. I won't pretend otherwise. But I can offer her something you never did, the freedom to be herself." He gestured toward the cabin, the garden, the peaceful valley around them. "I built this place with my own hands, every log and stone. It's not grand, but it's honest work. I've saved enough money to last us through the winter, and I know how to live off the land when necessary. More importantly, I know how to treat a woman as an equal partner, not as ornamental property. Pretty words, Charles sneered. But what happens when the romance wears off and Clara realizes what she's given up? When she's cold and hungry and isolated, with nothing but your love to sustain her? Clara had heard enough. She moved to stand directly in front of the marshal, her back straight and her chin raised defiantly. "Marshal Crawford, may I speak freely?" The lawman nodded, his expression unreadable. "I've lived 22 years as Clara Bennett, dutiful daughter of a wealthy man. I've had every material comfort, every advantage that money could buy. I've also been told what to think, what to feel, who to marry, and how to live every day of my life. I've been a prisoner in a golden cage, and I didn't even realize it until Luke showed me what freedom looked like." She turned to look at her father, and her voice grew stronger. "Papa, you say Luke has nothing to offer me, but you're wrong. He's offered me choice. He's offered me respect. He's offered me a partnership instead of ownership. Those things are worth more to me than all the money in your bank." "You're being foolish," Edmund said, but some of the fight had gone out of him. "You don't understand the realities of frontier life. This isn't a game. Clara, when winter comes, Clara interrupted, "I'll face it beside a man who sees me as his equal. I'd rather be cold and free than warm and caged." Tom Morrison spoke up from where he sat his horse, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "Marshal, if I may, I've lived in this territory for 20 years, and I've seen plenty of marriages, both good and bad. The best ones aren't built on money or social position. They're built on mutual respect and shared purpose. From what I can see, these two young people have that." Marshal Crawford was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Clara and Luke, reading the connection between them, the way they stood together facing the world. Finally, he turned to Edmund Bennett. "Mr. Bennett, I understand your concerns about your daughter's welfare, but I cannot find evidence of any crime here. Miss Bennett is of legal age, and she has stated clearly and repeatedly that her actions were voluntary. Unless you have proof that Mr. Carter used force or coercion, I have no grounds for arrest." Edmund's face went from red to purple to a dangerous shade of white. "This is outrageous. Are you telling me that a man can steal another man's bride from the altar and face no consequences?" "I'm telling you," the marshal replied firmly, "that a woman has the right to change her mind, even at the altar. That's not a crime, sir. That's freedom." Charles Morgan stepped forward, his hand moving toward his gun. "If the law won't give me satisfaction, maybe I'll take it myself." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and every man present understood their meaning. Luke's eyes hardened, and his hand drifted toward his own weapon, but Clara moved between them, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Stop!" she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone present. "I will not have blood shed over my choices, Charles. If you truly care for me, you'll respect my decision. And if you don't care for me, then what does it matter who I marry?" Charles stared at her for a long moment, his face working through a series of emotions: hurt, anger, wounded pride, and finally, something that might have been understanding. His hand fell away from his gun. "You're right," he said quietly. "If you don't want to be my wife, then I don't want you to be either. But Clara," his voice broke slightly, "I hope you know what you're doing." "I do," Clara said firmly. "For the first time in my life, I know exactly what I'm doing." Marshal Crawford mounted his horse and gathered his reins. "Mr. Bennett, this matter is closed as far as the law is concerned. I suggest you return to Dry Creek and let your daughter live her life as she sees fit." As the marshal prepared to leave, Clara called out to him, "Marshal Crawford, thank you for listening to the truth instead of just the accusations." The lawman touched his hat brim in acknowledgement. "Miss Bennett, I hope you'll be happy with your choice. But understand, if you ever need help, if circumstances change, the law will be there to protect you." "I understand," Clara replied, "but I won't need protection from the man I love." As the riders filed out of the valley, leaving dust and broken relationships in their wake, Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had faced down her father's anger, Charles's hurt, and society's disapproval, and she had emerged victorious. Not because she had won some grand prize, but because she had finally, truly, chosen her own life. Luke put his arm around her waist as they watched the last of the riders disappear over the ridge. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "Last chance to change your mind and go back to comfort and security." Clara leaned into his strength, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said. "This is where I belong. This is who I am. And this is the life I choose." 1 year later, Clara stood on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun paint the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold. The valley below was carpeted with wildflowers, lupines and paintbrush, columbines and mountain daisies, creating a tapestry of color that never failed to take her breath away. In her arms, she cradled a baby quilt she had sewn during the long winter evenings. Its simple pattern worked in blues and whites that reminded her of mountain skies. The year had tested them in ways she never could have imagined when she fled her wedding in ivory silk and desperate hope. Winter in the high country had been harsh and unforgiving, with snow piling so deep around the cabin that Luke had to dig tunnels to reach the stable and the root cellar. For 3 months, they had been completely cut off from the outside world, dependent entirely on Luke's careful preparations and their own resourcefulness. But they had not merely survived, they had thrived. Clara had learned to read weather signs in the behavior of animals and the color of clouds. She could preserve meat, tend the sick animals, and keep a fire burning through the coldest nights. Her hands, once soft from a life of leisure, were now calloused from honest work, and she wore those calluses like badges of honor. The garden that had been Luke's pride had become their shared passion. Together, they had expanded it, adding new varieties of vegetables and herbs, experimenting with different techniques for extending the growing season. Clara had discovered a talent for understanding plants that surprised them both, intuiting when to water, when to harvest, when to let things be. More importantly, they had built something together that went deeper than shared labor or even shared love. They had created a true partnership. Luke consulted her on every decision affecting their small homestead, from where to plant new trees to how to invest their modest savings. Clara had opinions about everything, and Luke not only listened to them but actively sought them out. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted her reverie, and Clara looked up to see a familiar figure riding into the valley. Tom Morrison, their nearest neighbor and one of the few people who visited them regularly, was approaching with his usual cargo of supplies and news from the outside world. "Clara," he called out, raising his hat in greeting. "How are you and Luke faring this fine spring morning?" "Wonderfully, Mr. Morrison," Clara replied, setting aside her sewing to greet their visitor properly. "Luke's up checking the high pasture, but he should be back soon. Come up and have some coffee." Morrison dismounted and climbed the porch steps, his weathered face creasing into a grin as he noticed the quilt in Clara's hands. "That's fine work," he said admiringly. My Ellen would be impressed with those stitches. Clara blushed with pleasure at the compliment. She had taught herself to quilt during the long winter months, working by lamplight while Luke repaired tack or read aloud from one of their precious books. The domestic skills she was acquiring felt like treasures, each new ability adding to her sense of competence and belonging. I have news, Morrison said as Clara poured coffee from the pot that always sat warming on the stove. Some of it good. Some of it, well, you can judge for yourself. Clara settled into her chair, prepared for whatever revelations Tom might bring. Over the past year, he had been their primary source of information about the wider world, carrying letters and packages when postal service was available, sharing gossip and news from the various settlements scattered across the territory. The good news first, Morrison continued, pulling a letter from his saddlebag. This came for you through the mail system in Pine Ridge. Looks like it's from back east somewhere. Clara's heart jumped as she recognized the handwriting on the envelope. It was from her childhood friend, Mary Catherine Wells, who had moved to Boston after marrying a merchant's son. They had corresponded sporadically over the years, but Clara had not heard from her since before the wedding that never was. She opened the letter carefully, scanning the familiar script with growing amazement. Mary Catherine wrote of her own life, her children, her husband's business success, but more importantly, she wrote of the stories that had reached even Boston's refined social circles about Clara Bennett's dramatic escape from an unwanted marriage. You have become quite famous in certain circles, Mary Catherine had written. There are women here who speak of you with admiration, even envy. They call you brave for choosing love over security. I wanted you to know that your story has given hope to others who feel trapped by circumstances and expectations. Clara looked up from the letter to find Morrison watching her with knowing eyes. Good news. I take it? Better than good, Clara said, folding the letter carefully. It seems that what we did has mattered to more people than just ourselves. Morrison nodded approvingly. That leads me to the other news, which isn't so much bad as complicated. Your father has been asking questions about you. Seems he's been in touch with Marshall Crawford, wanting to know if you're well, if you need anything. Clara's expression grew thoughtful. In the year since their confrontation, she had heard nothing directly from her father. She had assumed his silence meant either continued anger or complete disavowal of her existence. The possibility that he might be concerned about her welfare was both surprising and oddly touching. What kind of questions? She asked. Nothing threatening, Morrison assured her quickly. More like, well, like a father worried about his daughter's well-being. Crawford told him you were fine, that you and Luke had been seen in Pine Ridge occasionally, buying supplies and such, that you looked healthy and happy, before Clara could respond. Luke appeared in the doorway, having returned from his morning ride. His face lit up at the sight of their visitor, and he moved to greet Morrison with the easy warmth that characterized all his relationships. Tom, good to see you. How are Ellen and the children? All fine. Luke, growing like weeds, the boys especially. Speaking of which, I brought those seeds Ellen promised Clara. She says they're from her grandmother's garden back in Missouri. As the men settled into conversation about weather and crops, Clara found herself thinking about her father's inquiries. A year ago, she would have interpreted any interest from Edmund Bennett as an attempt to control or manipulate her. But time and distance had given her a different perspective on many things, including her relationship with her parents. She thought of the quilt in her lap, remembering suddenly that her mother had taught her the basic stitches when she was very young, before social obligations had overwhelmed such simple pleasures. She thought of her father's genuine pride in her accomplishments, even when those accomplishments fell outside the narrow boundaries he had set for her life. "Tom," she said suddenly, interrupting the men's discussion of irrigation techniques. "The next time you see Marshall Crawford, would you tell him something for me?" Morrison nodded, his expression attentive. "Tell him that Clara Carter—" She paused, savoring the sound of her married name. She and Luke had been wed by a traveling preacher the previous fall, a simple ceremony witnessed by Tom Morrison and his family. "Tell him that Clara Carter is well and happy, and that if her parents ever want to visit their daughter's home, they would be welcome here." Luke's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he said nothing. He had learned to trust Clara's instincts about people and relationships, even when they surprised him. Morrison smiled broadly. "I'll pass that along, Clara, and I think it's a fine message to send." After Morrison left, Clara and Luke worked together in their garden, preparing beds for the new seeds Ellen had sent. The physical labor felt good after the morning's emotional revelations, and they worked in companionable silence for a while. "Are you sure about inviting your parents?" Luke asked finally, not looking up from the furrows he was digging. Clara straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "I'm sure. Not because I want to reconcile completely, but because I want them to see who I've become. I want them to understand that I didn't run away from responsibility. I ran toward it." She gestured around their valley, taking in the cabin with its neat additions, the thriving garden, the small herd of cattle grazing in the distance. "This is real, Luke. What we've built here is substantial and meaningful. I'm not the pampered girl who fled her wedding anymore. I'm a woman who can make her own way in the world." Luke stood and moved to her side, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You've always been that woman, Clara. You just needed the chance to prove it to yourself." That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Clara retrieved her wedding veil from the trunk where she had stored it. The delicate lace was wrinkled and dusty, stained with the evidence of their desperate flight a year ago. But instead of throwing it away, she had kept it as a reminder, not of a wedding that never was, but of the day she had chosen her own life. "What are you thinking about?" Luke asked, noticing her contemplative mood. Clara held up the veil, letting the starlight catch in its torn threads. "I was thinking about choices," she said, "about how one moment of courage can change everything that comes after." She folded the veil carefully and set it aside. Tomorrow, she would use some of its lace to trim the baby quilt she was making, not for a child of their own. Not yet, but for Ellen Morrison's newest daughter. It seemed fitting somehow to transform something that represented one kind of beginning into something that celebrated another. "Do you ever regret it?" Luke asked quietly. "Giving up everything you knew for such an uncertain future?" Clara leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. Around them, their valley settled into peaceful slumber, filled with the sounds of night birds and wind through pine boughs. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the sound carried longing and wildness and freedom. "Never," she said firmly. "This isn't an uncertain future, Luke. This is the most certain thing I've ever known. We built this life with our own hands, and no one can take it away from us." She thought of Mary Catherine's letter, of women in distant cities finding inspiration in her story. She thought of her father's quiet inquiries, evidence that even the most rigid people could change given time and understanding. She thought of the baby quilt waiting to be finished, symbol of new life and continuing hope. "We're home," she said simply. And in those 2 words was all the contentment and certainty that had eluded her in 22 years of trying to be someone else's idea of perfect. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles but somehow blessing in their vastness. In the morning, there would be work to do, challenges to face, a life to be lived with all its ordinary difficulties and extraordinary rewards. But tonight, Clara Carter sat in the arms of the man she loved, in the home they had built together, surrounded by the wild beauty of a land that demanded everything and gave back freedom in return. It was more than enough. It was everything she had never known to dream of, and everything she would ever need.